Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to trace the incredible journey of how the United States transformed from a young, vulnerable nation hiding behind its oceans to the undisputed global superpower. It's an absolutely fascinating evolution, and honestly, to understand the geopolitical reality we live in today, we really have to understand exactly how we got here.
Our starting point is George Washington's explicit warning from his farewell address. This quote perfectly represents an early America that wanted absolutely nothing to do with global entanglements. For much of the country's early history, presidents meticulously shielded the nation from the great power conflicts raging over in Europe.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the isolationist beginnings. Second, 1898, birth of a superpower. Third, the reluctant global giant. Fourth, containment and the Cold War. Fifth, the unipolar moment. And finally, a return to isolationism? Part 1. The isolationist beginnings, steering clear of the world. Back in those early days, the primary goal was pretty simple. Keep the far wealthier, militarily superior European empires completely out of the Western Hemisphere. Early American leaders viewed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans not as bridges for international leadership, but as invaluable buffers, giant moats, basically, to protect their isolationism from foreign interference. And that allowed the young country to just focus on developing its economy and expanding its domestic territory in peace. But America's grand strategy eventually experienced a complete paradigm shift. We transitioned from a country that focused purely inward, actually tripling its domestic size between 1783 and 1853, to a rapidly industrializing nation that would soon begin looking outward, across those very same oceans, seeking a level of geopolitical influence that matched its booming economic strength. Which brings us to Part 2, 1898, birth of a superpower, where the oceans become bridges. The real inciting incident that permanently shattered America's long-held isolationism arrived in 1898 with a short but totally landscape-altering conflict known as the Spanish-American War. After that, the old global equilibrium was just gone forever. Suddenly, the United States was a full-fledged colonial power. They ended Spain's colonial empire in the Americas and took control of a massive territorial footprint stretching 10,000 miles, from Puerto Rico all the way over to the Philippines. So the crucial takeaway here is that American leaders, like President McKinley, realized the nation's immense economic and military growth demanded a completely new foreign policy. The U.S. now had almost all the attributes of a great power, including a battle-tested navy, and, well, it could no longer pretend to just be an isolated republic hiding from the world. Part 3. The reluctant global giant, the pull of the world wars. As we move into the 20th century, the U.S., basically acting as a reluctant hero, was repeatedly dragged onto the global stage through the sheer gravity of the world wars. Over just a 50-year span, the walls of isolationism rapidly fell apart. We go from the Spanish-American War straight into two devastating global conflicts that forced America's hand time and time again. Take World War I, for example. President Woodrow Wilson actually ran for re-election on the catchy slogan, "He kept us out of war." He desperately wanted to stick to that 19th century isolationist playbook, but he was forced to abandon it when Germany started sinking U.S. ships in the Atlantic, and then the British intercepted the infamous Zimmermann telegram, revealing Germany's offer to help Mexico literally take over U.S. territory. The threat wasn't abstract anymore, it was physical and immediate. Following these massive conflicts, we see a really stark contrast in American strategy. After World War I, America retreated inward again. They refused to join the League of Nations, passed neutrality acts, and embraced economic protectionism. But after the devastating toll of World War II and the absolute shock of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, U.S. leaders realized they couldn't just retreat and hide anymore. Instead, they took the exact opposite approach, propping up Europe and rebuilding Japan to prevent the spread of totalitarianism. Part 4. Containment and the Cold War, the new geopolitical rivalry. And this brings us to the climax of our story, where the U.S. officially abandoned isolationism for a high-stakes strategy of global containment against a brand-new rival, the Soviet Union. The 1947 Truman Doctrine is absolutely essential to understanding our modern world. It officially committed the U.S. to intervene in faraway conflicts during peacetime. President Truman argued that American national security now depended on way more than just the physical security of American territory. This was a sharp, permanent break from their historical traditions. To counter the Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact and the heavily fortified Iron Curtain, the U.S. spearheaded what we now call the liberal world order. They launched a multi-billion-dollar Marshall Plan, formed groundbreaking peacetime military alliances like NATO, and built international institutions like the UN and the World Bank. They also engaged in massive, costly proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam to physically resist communist expansion.
Part 5. The Unipolar Moment, Standing at the Summit. After a decades-long twilight struggle, the exhausted Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991. The Cold War was over, and the world entered a brand-new, highly unique era. In his landmark essay, Charles Krauthammer correctly pointed out that the immediate post-Cold War world wasn't multipolar at all, despite what a lot of foreign policy experts were assuming at the time. Krauthammer coined it unipolarity. This essentially meant the United States, attended that its Western allies, stood completely unrivaled in geopolitical reach and economic power. There was no longer a competing superpower balancing the scales. America was the single, undisputed center of world power. To back this up, Krauthammer highlighted a pretty surprising number, 5.4%. That was the percentage of the American gross national product being spent on defense at the time, and it was actually projected to fall. He used this specific figure to argue that maintaining this unipolar world was actually quite affordable, strongly pushing back against critics who claimed America was suffering from imperial overstretch. And this brings our narrative loop full circle, beautifully contrasting George Washington's early desire to hide from the world with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's soaring declaration that America now stood at the absolute global summit. The transformation from a vulnerable young nation to a global titan was complete. Part 6, a return to isolationism, the lingering tension. So why does all of this history matter to you today? Well, because the internal battle over America's role in the world is far from over. It's actually a topic of fierce debate right now. Krauthammer notes that the desire to return home and tend its vineyards is a natural, almost God-given American urge. I mean, it makes total sense for an island continent, bordered by friendly neighbors and protected by two vast oceans, to just want to cleanse itself of the old world squabbles, right? However, he firmly argues that if America wants stability, it cannot rely on the oceans to magically provide it. It has to actively create that stability on the world stage. International stability is never the norm. It's the product of self-conscious action by the greatest power. We'll leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. As unprecedented new threats rise, and as the global landscape continues to rapidly evolve, will America continue to lead and sustain this unipolar preeminence? Or will that historic, deeply natural pull of isolationism eventually win out? It's a massive question, and how it gets answered will undoubtedly define our future.